once I get the fourth, set.
Definitely.
So,
Sweet.
so yeah, so check in with me tomorrow on that.
I will. I'm gonna be up your ass about it. I'm gonna annoy you.
Yeah, so definitely. But I guess we can get into this
Yeah.
episode.
So tonight we're gonna focus on critical thinking, and then I think the next one, for sake of your timeline, let's go with yours again. I really want to dive into like that piece of paper you had.
Right.
Like if we can just do the whole cast on what you presented to the kids in that paper, would that be cool? Would that be?
Yeah, yeah, that's fine.
And then I'll snip that up into as many nuggets as we can get out of it, and then that way, um, if we can do that before this weekend or during this weekend, and I'll have it snipped up, and then that way you'll have something to post
To
every day
push.
up till the
Right.
weekend.
Right. Okay.
So let's shoot for a double header this week
Okay.
slash weekend. That way we can get that content out.
Okay. Absolutely.
Sweet. All right. So essentially, we're going to talk critical thinking, the filter, um, helping the consumer, the client, figure out what's important, what's legitimate, what's real, what's genuine, what's responsible, what's professional.
Right.
Take it away, Dwayne.
Right. So the place where I wanted to start was, and we've talked about this in the past, just the concept of common sense. And we kind of joked about it in a previous podcast. Common sense isn't all that common, yada yada yada. Well, the thing is, when it comes to health and fitness, I start to question what exactly is common sense. Like, is there even a such thing as common sense? So some of the questions I started to ask myself when I was formulating this idea was, I might consider it common sense to know how much food to put on my plate. I might consider it common sense to know what type of exercise I need to do, or what changes I need to make, or what exercises I need to avoid in reaching my goals, right? So the thing is, when I think about common sense, it's like, well, this is something that should be innately in me. Like, I should already know this stuff. And my question is, well, let's take a concrete example. How much food do I put on my plate? Like, how do I know that? Where did I learn it? Why do I know how much food to put on my plate? Like, and if I was to ask a person, I would expect to get like a really dumb look back at me, like, oh, well, I know how hungry I am. I know how much food to put, and I would say, no, you don't. You really don't. What you put on your plate is a function of habit.
Mm-hmm.
You you try to gauge how hungry you think you are. Consequently, you try to gauge how much food you need to put on your plate to satisfy that hunger. However, where's our baseline? Like, where did that come from? Have you ever taken the time to measure out what is a serving of each food item on your plate? Have you ever taken the time to eat slowly enough for that feeling of fullness to kick in? Probably not. Most of us eat way too fast anyway because we're too busy and we're just shoveling this food down our throats. So to me, there has to be a concept. That's where common sense comes into it, where we have to start to establish a baseline. So
Right. I think your example is great in driving the point that assumption gets confused and distorted with common sense, right? We assume a lot of things just by nature, just by habit, just by this is how it's been done, this is why we do it. But there's never been a critical analysis. And when we say critical analysis, that doesn't mean it's not common sense. It just means that we're making sure that we have the distinction between um, the assumption and common sense. I mean, the same, with nutrition, there's a great example. The same thing with exercise. The reason why there's so much bogus in exercise is because there's a lot of assumptions about baseline, about fundamentals, and thus those assumptions that are incorrect, and then built upon that incorrect assumption leads to more and more complex issues that don't have to be issues to start. So I definitely think that example was perfect in understanding that assumption and common sense are not the same thing.
Exactly, and that goes back, and I can't stress this next thing enough, that it was a conversation between you and I that kind of got this whole thing started, where you basically told me to question everything that you say, question everything that I hear from every other source. And I'm kind of skipping ahead in my notes a little bit, but I felt like that was the perfect time to interject that if nothing else, we have to be willing to question these assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
If nothing else, the fact that, like I said, I fully expect for someone to give me like a dumb look if I ask them how do they know how much food to put on their plate. Like, it's like, well, duh, it's common sense. I know how much food to put. It's like, but have you ever taken the time to really critically look at how much food needs to be on that plate?
Right.
Really not. And I don't want to scare anyone off by saying, hey, the only solution is to approach every meal with a measuring cup and a scale. Right. I don't want to go there neither. The thing that I want people to start understanding is let's accept the fact that we've never done a critical analysis on portion size, on how much food it takes to satisfy our hunger. We've never taken the time to critically look at those factors. Mm-hmm. That's all I'm asking. I'm asking that we take the time to critically look at those factors. And if you're willing, sure, I would say measure your food for a little while, for a week. I would say use the common identifiers as far as, a handful of this is a serving, a deck of cards of that is a serving. I would say just employ that strategy for a period of time, just so that you have a baseline of critical knowledge to build off of.
Subtle things that make you more aware, and thus being aware is when being aware is the door to common sense, and shutting the door to assumption, right? Awareness, right? Assumption is just that. It's assumption. It's blind. It's not awareness. It's assumed.
Right.
So moving away from that assumption and moving on to awareness, I think, is that bridge from assumption to common sense, and that being the tool of critical thinking.
Right. So with that awareness, with that willingness to question our basic assumptions, that's the foot in the door. But once we open the door, then we see that there are opportunities to employ this critical thinking strategy to other things, because the other issue that I find most of us face is this overwhelming amount of information that's being thrown at us at all times. Mm-hmm. So the easy example would be to stay with nutrition on that, to say, one day they're telling me this is good, the next day they're telling me this is bad. Coconut oil is good, avocados are good, the next day it's bad and it should be avoided. It's like, okay, at some point I just want some good solid facts. I don't want to build my nutrition program off of what I thought was well-researched, good information, and then just to hear a couple days later or a couple months later or whenever, okay, you have to throw out all of that research because a new study has shown XYZ. I don't want to put myself through that. So as we put a foot in the door with this critical thinking strategy, that we start to question our own knowledge, then we are able to start questioning the information that is thrown at us. Mm. And that becomes just a slightly higher level of critical thinking, to where I may receive a piece of information and say, okay, that does not fit in my schema, I can throw that out immediately.
Mm-hmm.
There's no point in me even paying attention to that information. You know,
Right.
that just does not jive well with this foundation of knowledge that I've started to build. So I can throw that out immediately.
Right.
So that's kind of where I'm going with this. And it's easy for us to stick with nutrition because there's so much nutrition information that's thrown at us at any given time. But this I don't wanna pigeonhole it just to nutrition. This applies to all areas of health, fitness,
Mm-hmm.
and everything else. So I'm sure you can come up with an example that may apply to strength and conditioning that is something that we all assume to be true, so we don't question it anymore, but really we probably need to start questioning things just to see. And the hard thing is it may be good information, however it may not be good for me at this exact moment.
Right.
So do you have any examples or any thoughts on from the strength and conditioning side where we would all benefit from employing just a little bit more critical thinking?
Yeah, I mean, so going back to fundamentals, right? There's a lot of assumptions there in establishing like basic strengthening protocols and things like that. People just think, your standard textbook answers are how you get somebody stronger. You're working in the 80%. You're lifting heavy weights. You spend a little bit of time on that, and then we just move on from that. And strength and conditioning is trying to not, I shouldn't say it's in itself is trying to evolve, but people are trying to spice it up and be everything but strength and conditioning focused, right? So where they take these basic fundamentals, these textbook baselines, and then they just stick with those and then move on to something else completely. Whereas they just assume that, hey, let's just do this simple progression here, and then once that textbook progression is put in play, we check the block there, we can move on. And the fact is, well, no, that's not enough. You can't just stop at that textbook answer. You have to make tweaks, you have to make adjustments, you have to make developments, you have to realize that getting stronger is a lot more complex than just the textbook answer. And in fact, if you stick with that answer for too long, it's going to regress you, right? And these are still just the fundamentals. We can't even move away from the fundamentals because our assumption is so nearsighted, right? I keep saying this repeated word of mature vision. We're so quick wanting, we think 4-week strength cycle, like that's almost like an oxymoron to me. Like 4-week strength cycle, like 4 weeks is nothing to do anything, right? We haven't even touched the surface of developing somebody there. So I think there's a lot of assumptions that these assumptions in the strength and conditioning world just come from the lack of a mature vision, just not honing in on something and developing it. And you'll see a lot of this comes from a lack of experience, right? Those that don't have a focus, don't have a passion or experience, tend to just be all over the place, and thus they rely on assumptions rather than relying on developed, accumulated experience. And I think to translate into what you're talking about, that baseline, that broad base of knowledge, is the first filter that I would focus on. And that broad baseline of knowledge is experience, right? So experience is factual, it's objective, because it's the accumulation of common things that are related, right? And so when you get this one wild card out there that doesn't line up with your experience, your baseline, your first filter, you don't automatically throw it away, but you can already have that hesitation, like, okay, we need to look into this. This doesn't line up with my base. This doesn't line up with my experience. So that's filter number one. And I tend to try and have people have multiple filters, multiple pieces in a hierarchy in order to, one, self-regulate their own training, or to see if they can trust a gym, see if they can trust a coach by applying that same set of filters, right? It's not just one filter, it's multiple filters in a hierarchy. But the first one that's critical is the baseline, is the experience. And unfortunately, that's just going to come with time. So,
right. So on that note, do you have any particular story that you might share from your own experience on how do you apply filters to your own workout or to your own progress, or maybe something from the past that you don't mind sharing?
Yeah. So essentially, there's, I guess the best one to bring up would be sticking with a particular program and just viewing the program. We're doing this program, we're doing this person's plan, and so that's got me in a box, and I gotta maintain my left and right limits within this box. And from this, I'm going to progress. And if I don't progress, instead of assuming there's something wrong with the program, we're like, oh, we take the cop-out routes. Oh, I didn't eat enough today. Oh, I didn't get enough sleep. Oh, I didn't do this, right? Instead of criticizing the program, that cookie cutter program, which is what a lot of strength and conditioning coaches rely on, a lot of fancy ones out there with a whole bunch of unsubstantiated pseudoscience behind them. They won't question that because of how advanced it is. It's obviously not the program's issue. It's my issue. And the fact of the matter is when something stops working, we discussed this before, you need to look at the recent training history and adjust fire. Like, quit being hell-bent on thinking that this is going to create some sort of manipulative effect for you that's advanced in your athletic ability. If you've stopped basic progress, if you're not getting stronger, you're not getting faster, you're not getting more conditioned, it's not working. So there's been multiple times where I've been on cookie cutter programs, and not to bash those, because as a beginner, that's where else do you start? You have to have that. But it's when you don't let go of those, when you don't spread your wings and fly, that you get stuck to those programs. And that's where a lot of strength coaches make their split, is instead of spreading their wings and flying, they'll just stick to these cookie cutter programs and then chase the next shiny object that's not related to strength, not related to conditioning, but keeps them validated to themselves, I guess you could say. So definitely, I think personal experience would be the cookie cutter programs, and just not moving away from them.
Right. I can share a quick story from my own experience, which was, and I've shared this in the past. I grew up during an era where like muscle and fitness was the Bible of all training of all sorts, and fortunately I got to the point where that was just totally absurd to me. But for several reasons, and I'm not trying to put down the publication, I'm saying that is not a credible source of information for me to build my whole workout regimen off of.
Right.
And that being said, this is my learning experience, which is the opposite of what we're discussing, the opposite of using good critical thinking habits. But I built my entire workout program myself for 10 years or better off of stuff that I was reading out of Muscle and Fitness. And because I was working out so hard, I was kind of sharing information with other gym heads who were also getting their information from Muscle and Fitness. So we had this like collective ignorance that was circling around, and
all from the same source.
Right. And my thought was, I had a very limited view of what I thought was personal training, because up to that point I was working out in a big box gym at the time. So what I saw of personal training was just basically a guy with a nice physique who was showing a novice around the gym and showing them just basic movements and stuff. And at that point, and it was, I don't know, it may have been a little bit of arrogance, or maybe I really wasn't at that level that I needed assistance from that type of trainer. I don't know, but when I saw that, I'm like, no, I don't need a personal trainer. I know how to do these exercises. The way that I limited myself was I was not in a good position to be programming for myself.
Right.
And I was not in a position where I was setting clear goals. I was not recording my progress. So I'm working out and that's not an exaggeration. I worked out for probably 10 years, working out daily, in the gym, grinding every day, but I had no system in place to track any type of goals. And if I look at myself during that period, maybe I was getting stronger, but at the same time, what was my ratio of strength to body fat? Was I really focused on growing the way that I really wanted to grow? And the short answer is no, I wasn't, because I was not on an organized program. So I think that mentality is still very popular, because I can go to the gym, I'm sure you could do the same, and you see people who are working out extremely hard. They are putting in the hours, but they are not necessarily meeting what you would assume would be their goals. Because they have not applied any degree of critical thinking to what they're doing.
Right.
It's not an organized system.
It's just checking the block.
Right. It's like, hey, I spent 2 hours in the gym today. I feel good because of that. And I'm like, well, okay, you should feel some sense of accomplishment because you did carve out that block of time. You went in there, you hit it hard, but
we need to take this next step. We need to grow that.
Right. And can that time be used more effectively? And
Definitely.
The answer to me is absolutely yes, it can. If you can, I mean, theoretically, I don't need you to work out 2 hours on an undisciplined program. Give me an hour of focus, and I can probably double your results that you're getting. But it needs to be an hour of focus. Use that other hour to meal prep or study or spend time with the kids, whatever. But you have to be able to. That goes back to what we said. First of all, you have to be willing to question your assumptions, and then you have to be receptive to outside information. Once you start questioning, then it seems natural that you'll say, okay, now that I'm questioning my assumptions, I start to realize there are holes in my knowledge, and how do I start to fill those holes with good seed, with good fertile knowledge, and that's where someone like you or I would be able to come in. Like, okay, let's look at the whole program and make sure that the goals are solid. Make sure that you are recording the data that you need to be recording, so that we can get some feedback on whether the program is working. Things like that. But that would be my story, which is the opposite of critical thinking, where I don't want another person to do what I did. I don't want you to genuinely go hit it hard for 10 years and not necessarily get the result that you probably deserve to get, just because your program is not what it needs to be.
Right. I think that leads perfectly into the second filter that I wanted to bring up, right? So the first one's establishing that baseline, establishing experience. And again, this can be applied personally, or you can ask your coach or trainer that you're vetting, if you will, somebody that you're looking to see is qualified. After you have some experience, the second thing is you have to acknowledge bias, right? You have to acknowledge your bias, right? For the last, those 10 years of training, how much time could have been saved had you critically acknowledged your bias and realized, like, look, here's the good components to my bias, but here's the bad components to my bias that's holding me back, right? I have the experience, I've got a bunch of knowledge now, but I've got a bunch of meat on my plate. I've got the experience, but now I need to acknowledge the bias. I need to cut the fat off the meat, right? That's the next filter we got to establish. And again, that can be applied personally, or that can be applied to your coach, right? Does the person you're vetting have the experience you want, or the not the experience you want, but have in a large amount of experience? And two, does their bias line up with your goals per se, but also does their bias does the benefits of their bias outweigh the negatives? So that's definitely another critical piece to acknowledge. We can't just have experience without acknowledging the biases.
Absolutely. So if we can, it feels like we're getting into a lot of meat right now. If we could just back it down a little bit. So is there anything in your opinion that is just absurdly fails the critical thinking test that is a common assumption, whether fitness, nutrition, health related, just anything at all? That what's the first thing that comes to mind to you that this is a commonly held belief, but it just totally fails the critical thinking test?
The quick fixes, right? And this goes both nutritionally and fitness wise. We can blame it on the fitness industry, but if it wasn't fed into, then it wouldn't grow. But essentially taking advantage of people's desires for the quick fix has launched the fitness and nutrition industry, right? And so instead of putting out truth and good knowledge, we're feeding into excuses. So what I mean by that, a good example of the nutrition side of the house is, hey, don't worry about counting calories anymore. You can lose weight by doing X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, yes, like you don't have to count calories, but the fundamental understanding of you need to monitor portions, you need to be in a deficit somehow, some way, is fundamental to that weight loss goal. And then somebody just, instead of somebody instilling that upon you, they just feed into your excuse like, hey, I know that stuff's hard. Here's the quick fix. Here's my diet plan. Just follow this to the T, and no matter what's going on, you're going to lose weight, right? Mm-hmm. Same thing with the fitness side of the house. You want to get stronger. Well, I can make you stronger, faster, leaner, and spend less time in the gym. It's like, well, that couldn't be further from the truth. Yes, we don't want to kill you in the gym for 2 hours, but at the same time, if you're moving from novice to intermediate to some serious level of training, as a novice, you might spend 30 minutes in the gym just because you're so deconditioned. That's all you could work up to. But as you get more conditioned, as you get more stronger, the volume has to go up, and in order for volume to go up, more time has to be spent in there, right? Your 30-minute novice sessions and getting gains from that are no longer applicable, and you need an hour to an hour and a half of work to put in the same amount of response that you got as a novice. Now, with that being said, I'm not saying everyone has to do that, but we need to acknowledge, like, if you're not willing to do that, then you're at your cap, and we need to work within our cap, and there needs to be some come to Jesus moment. Like, look, what's the next step? Am I going? Do I have the time to put in the next work? And if not, then what can I do to maximize what I'm doing now? So I think those are the common sense things. Is you have to acknowledge that if you want to lose weight, you need to eat less. That's common sense. And you have to acknowledge if you want to get stronger, more conditioned, better, you have to put in more work. Mm-hmm. Common sense that's applicable and that's not assumed.
Right. On that note, you said a couple things that I wanted to comment on. So the first thing that comes to mind is, and like I said, I've said this several times, and I know that I will say it several more times. I'm not in a position to ever put down anyone's program. I just try to shed light and offer my opinion on these different programs. So I give an example. I know of a person who told me, they were following a certain nutrition program that's based on like a point system or something like that. And it was to the point that they would consciously eat certain foods earlier in the day so that they could save all their points at night when they would binge on junk food. It's like
that defeats the fundamental purpose that we're trying to get to.
It totally goes against that totally fails the critical thinking test. You know,
the common sense.
Yeah, the common sense test. It's like, okay, common sense tells you that if you desire a certain result from this nutrition plan, that you shouldn't be binging on junk food at any point of the day. Not at night, not during the day, not after a workout, not ever. You know, that behavior pattern is something that we need to address. Mm-hmm. So the fact that you might justify to yourself, hey, I'm still within the limits of my nutrition program because I'm still within my points, or I'm still within my macros or whatever. It's like, but you totally went against the common sense. What common sense would tell any novice that you can't just like starve yourself during the day so that you can binge on junk food at night.
You can't justify your bad actions, right? Common sense has brought to light that you need to change this and change it, not manipulate it.
Right. The other thing, and I definitely would like to get your opinion on this, is when we're talking about my hierarchy of critical thinking and the way that I value knowledge, and this is just me, and I definitely welcome your opinion on this. I'm a little bit skeptical of any program that is so convoluted that I need an expert to explain it to me. Mm-hmm. You know, I have a little bit. I'm skeptical of that. I can't discount every instance where that happens, but I'm skeptical. At some point, I feel like fitness and nutrition is simple enough that it should be able to be brought down to anyone's level. Mm-hmm. You know, so if
it's not that it's not complex, it's that the complexity is for the professional, and it's up to the professional to translate it simplistically for application. And those that don't translate it simplistically and like to show off the complexity, that tends to show a lack of experience, a need for self-validation, and wanting the shiny light effect of like, hey, look at what I can do, because I actually don't know what I'm doing.
Right. And on that note, there's something in particular, and I won't call any names. I think this particular group is really trying to help people eat better and be healthier and all that. But I saw someone had a whole campaign that they designed, that they were putting down seedless fruit. And my whole thing was, that did not pass the critical thinking test. It didn't pass the common sense test to me, because I don't know. I will, in full disclosure, I will say that I have not done enough research on. I haven't done any research on seedless fruit. So,
well, the reason why I suspect it didn't pass your critical thinking is because by nature we get red flagged with radicalness, right? I always preach rational, not radical. And when we hear radical things, we either go one of two ways. We're super attracted to it, or we're super skeptical of it because right. of the nature of it being radical. And radical doesn't have to mean extreme, but radical in the sense of its definition, like something completely cut off, no ifs, ands, or buts to it, no exceptions. So saying, I have no idea what you're talking about, but saying, hey, seedless fruit, no go, period, end of discussion. Well, that's the definition of being radical. So
right. And to bring it down to the least complex level, in keeping with our discussion of critical thinking, my thought would be, any average person who is trying to live a healthier lifestyle, there are easily 100 things that you need to start looking at before you start looking at seedless fruit on the
you've got to get you got to get the basics in order first, right? Don't put all your money on seedless fruit.
And seriously, I say there are easily 100 things that you need to address before you start betting on seedless fruit. That's just my thought, So there's
good job getting rid of all seedless fruit, but that 2,000 calories in Hershey bars didn't go anywhere. So
right, or that Bulkers smoothie that you down every morning on your way to work, regardless of if you work out or not. That's probably not a good idea. That doesn't pass the common sense test. It doesn't pass the critical thinking test. Mm-hmm. So there's that's a good segue into some of you gave us a couple thoughts on your hierarchy as far as critical thinking as a means to set a foundation. You talked about it as a means to acknowledge bias, to start trimming the fat, and let's just get down to the heart of what activities are actively leading me to where I'm trying to go. So I have my own little hierarchy that I started taking notes on. So for me, the information has to make sense, and that's outside of common sense. It just has to, for lack of a better word, it just has to feel right. Mm-hmm. I feel like you said, this is very complex stuff that we're talking about, but at its most basic level of application, it should feel like it's right. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's the first filter that I run everything through. Does this feel right? Does it feel like this activity will actually help me get to where I'm going, or help anyone get to where they're going? Is there an agenda there? Is there a reason why someone is pushing this information on the public or on me or on whomever? And is the agenda that they're pushing reason enough for me to throw out that information totally? Or is it something that maybe I can say, okay, this person is coming from a slanted perspective, but that doesn't mean that the information is totally bogus. It just means I have to keep that perspective in mind as I try to apply this information to a practical program. Mm-hmm. So, that's the first level. The second level filter that I apply is, did this information come from a trusted source? So I do a lot of reading, as I'm sure that you do as well. So once someone has proved to be a trusted source, I tend to accept that information a little bit easier than from a non-trusted source. Mm-hmm. So, once I've already vetted a source of information, once I say, okay, this person is delivering good quality information, they're not coming from an agenda, they're not trying to sell me a product or anything like that, okay, now I can start to trust that information, and I may be in a better position to apply that to my program or to a program that I'm writing or what have you. So and I think probably the last level for me is just good, solid academic research. Mm-hmm. If the information cannot cite some sort of academic background to which I can actually go back, and of course we may not have time to go back and read every study, but I need to know that what you're telling me is based on some sort of solid research. So that is just as simple as, we all hear this information, it's bombarded on us, it's piped at us through social media, we hear it through our colleagues and our coworkers and all of that. So I boiled it down to one question. It's like, okay, hey, that sounds interesting. Where did you get that from? Or what's the research behind that? Mm-hmm. That single question will probably filter out 80% of the nonsense. Right. Because most stuff is passed through word of mouth. It's based on, I assume something, I pass it on to you, you start to assume it, you pass it on to someone else, they
Tell
start
a lie long enough, it becomes truth.
it becomes truth. Right. So for anything that kind of starts to feel funny on any one of those levels, I ask that simple question, hey, that sounds very interesting. Tell me about the research behind that. And that usually throws it out, because most people can't cite any research behind it. It's just like, oh, well, that sounds viable or that sounds reasonable, so let's just run with it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're actively trying to avoid, because a lot of stuff sounds good, but it's not grounded in sound research. So we need to be willing to question that.
Right. Definitely. I think for me it boils down to some similar stuff. If I'm having somebody look for a trainer or a coach, the first thing they need to do is establish experience. What is this person's experience level? Do they have a lot of experience? Do they have personal experience in what they're doing? Right. A lot of people out there aren't practicing what they preach. I know that sounds old school, but that is so piercing to every other aspect of validity. If they're not practicing what they preach, then I mean we're talking a plethora of other issues. That's already big no number one. So what kind of experience do they have? Where's their experience coming from? And are they personally applying that experience still? Secondly, the bias, right? Cutting the fat off. Where is their bias? Bias doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. We just need to acknowledge their bias so that we see where they're coming from, right? And does the biases good outweigh the bad, right? So that's step number 2. And then step number 3 that you want to ask your trainer, your coach, is credentialing, right? And I don't just mean credentialing proper, but I mean all of the traditional education, right? Like, what's your credentialing? Do you have a proper source of education? Who's been your influence? Have you come, when I mean education, is it unbiased raw data that you have been presented with? We hope that credentialing and schooling tends to be unbiased and just presenting information, and it's up to that person and their experience to translate that. So experience, bias, credentialing, proper education. And then lastly, their motives, their passion, like, are they in this for the sake of what you're wanting out of it, or is this just a business scheme for them? And you can see a lot of this in going back to their experience, right? Are they personally practicing what they preach, right? Are their motives where they need to be? But motives fall last in the filter, because we know plenty of people who have great intentions, great motives, super drive, but just they don't know what the hell they're doing, and that's worse than somebody with bad intentions but at least has appropriate information. So experience, bias, credentialing, and then their passion and their motives, those need to all fall in line before you check yes onto the trainer, or you ask yourself that to filter yourself and continually hone in your own skill.
Right. So for the person that may be listening that understands that they may need some help, that they have been overwhelmed with information and options and etc. So when you talk about experience, bias, motives, and credentials, what, as we start to push this thing, what does that person actually, what questions do they ask to a potential trainer to say, hey, this person, I like what they're saying. They're not just they're not salesy. They're not pitching product to me. This is the acid test. They passed it. I'm willing to move forward and try this person out.
What's direct questions to ask?
Right. Like what questions should be in mind, like when they're approaching this potential trainer?
Just be straightforward with them. When you're straightforward, you get natural responses, and you need natural responses. You don't want them trying to prep up a response, or give you a textbook response. Just ask them straightforward. Hey, how long you been doing this? Boom, experience. Hey, what do you enjoy most? Boom, bias. Hey, how did you get into this? What's your background in your education? Boom, credentialing. And then it's like, finally the last one can kind of be an accumulation of how they've given the response, right? So the last one it's not a direct question, it's the responses to those first three questions, where you can see their motives, you can see their responses. Are they a sly kind of person, or are they just telling you straight up and having a good conversation with you? Are they genuine, or are they sly, right? That dictates the last filter, which is the motives. So how long you been doing this? What do you enjoy most? Where'd you learn all this stuff from? And then judge those responses, and boom, you've got yourself a solid filter for common sense, and giving yourself a solid ability to judge if you need to pursue this person, this gym, this program, or if you need to move on.
Right, absolutely. And I love the way that you laid that out. I feel like that was a perfect foundation. I would maybe add one thing to that, and I would ask a potential trainer that I was looking to work with, what plan do you see for me, and over what timeline do you plan to do you foresee delivering those results?
Sure.
And to me, that starts to touch on everything else that you said. Is this person honest? What is this person's character?
Mm-hmm.
Are they just trying to sell me a PT package just to get money, or is their heart really in the right place, that they're going to design a program with my needs and my best interest in mind?
Right.
And just the answer to that question, are you an honest person? You're going to tell me, hey, I can get you the results you're looking for in the next 30 days. Probably not. Probably not.
30 days for $30.
Right. It's like, okay, depending on your schedule, depending on your compliance, your adherence, depending on what you have going on,
That's a better response.
I can map out the program. If you are able to stick to the program, I would expect, I don't give hard guarantees, because that's just not really feasible in this business. But I would expect to see some improvement, maybe not as far as body composition, but I would see some psychic improvement. I would see that within the first couple weeks, definitely. I would see improvements in other areas relatively quickly. So I would try to convince that person, let's not look at maybe the classic indicators that you may be wanting to look at. Don't look at the numbers on the scale. Don't look at the measuring tape. Don't look at that type of thing. Not for the first several weeks.
Yeah.
Let's focus on adherence for the first several.
Let's get in routine, and we'll worry about that stuff down the road.
All of that will fall into place if we can focus on the routine and adherence and compliance and all of that. If we develop this relationship.
Let's learn rhythm before we start trying to play a song,
Right.
So cool. I think that's a good way to sum it up there. So
yeah, for sure. I say we just wrap there.
Awesome. Perfect. That worked out really well.
Yeah.